Welcome to Around the Writer's Table, a podcast focusing on the crossroads of creativity, craft, and conscious living for writers of all ages and backgrounds. Your hosts are Gina, Melody, and Kimbu, three close friends and women of a certain age who bring to the table their eclectic backgrounds and unique perspectives on the trials, tribulations, and the joys of writing. So pull up a chair and get comfortable here around the writer's table.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Around the Writer's Table. I'm Gina Hogan Edwards here with my co-hosts, Kimbu and Melody, and we've got another exciting episode lined up for you. I particularly am drawn to this topic, and I think that you will be too. But first, let's do a couple of introductions. As I said, I'm Gina Hogan Edwards. I am a retreat leader, an editor, creativity coach, a writer, obviously a podcast host, along with my great friends here, Kimbu and Melody. So ladies, introduce yourselves. Melody, you want to go first?
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Melody Scout, and I love everything to do with plants. I am a plant spirit medicine healer and teacher. I am a landscape designer, a landscaper, gardener, and I wrote a book about my love of plants and nature called Soul of the Seasons, available at most online bookstores.
And I am Kimbu York. I am a professional genre author, romance, fantasy, science fiction in the works. And I also do productivity coaching for writers and other creatives, but mostly I focus on writers on helping get the words out, the hard part of the job, getting the words down on the paper, the screen. Like, what do we even say these days? I don't know. And I also run the 1 Million Words Club, which is a membership community on Discord, again, focused on process and productivity for writers. So that is me.
Awesome. So I know that we've got a lot going on in our work and personal lives, but we're here to talk today about a topic that has really captivated my imagination and my attention probably over the last 2 years specifically. So we're going to talk about discovery writing today, and I'm going to be handing it off to Kimbu because she actually has a book on that topic, but we're going to go a little bit even like dialing in deeper to the specific topic of intuition. So Kimbu, get us started in that discussion.
Sure. So my book is not on the tip of my tongue. That is, I need more coffee these days. My book is called By the Seat of Your Pants, Secrets of Discovery Writing. And when I have all my coffee, then I remember that title a lot more easily than I did right then. It is focused on explaining what discovery writing is and has exercises in it. And I cover a lot of territory in that book. But one of the things that has really come up in discussions with people about discovery writing as a technique, which is what I focus on, is the question of how intuition plays into that and why it is so important to discovery writing. So discovery writing, for those listeners who may not be familiar with that phrase, is the new fancy term that we use instead of pantsing. It is the act of leaning into your curiosity to discover the story as you write it. There are different ways to be a discovery writer. There are different forms of the technique. I don't like narrowing it down to one specific type of writing. It can be very useful even for planners and plotters at some point in their process. What I dig into in the book, though, is how important intuition is in being a discovery writer. Whether you're what I call a straight shooter, which is somebody who starts at the beginning of the story and writes all the way through to the end of the story, which is something authors like Dean Wesley Smith do, or whether you do a lot of recursive going back and editing before you write the next section, something I do. We are leaning heavily on our intuition. So Becca Syme, I know a lot of authors who might be listening to this are already familiar with her work. She does have a book on being a writer who leans on intuition. I think it's called Dear Writer, Are You Intuitive? Isn't that it, Gina? I think that's the name of it.
I think so. Yeah.
Anyway, we'll have a link to that in the show notes, so don't worry too much about remembering it.
Yes.
There will not be a test at the end of this podcast. It is the element of relying on both pattern matching and experience. So, for instance, a really familiar one is fairy tales. You know, the princess loses her shoe, and then the prince finds the shoe and then goes and searches for her using the shoe. A very early attempt at matchmaking services. So I wouldn't recommend it for anybody, but we're all familiar with that, right? So if a character loses her shoe at the big party being given by her super rich boss, right, in a modern romance, our instinct, our intuition, because we're so primed for that particular storyline, would be, oh, the romantic lead's going to find the shoe, and then something's going to happen, and that will help him find the girl he fell in love with. Is that necessarily how you're going to write that story? No, but it does lead into different explorations that you can take on that particular trope or pattern of a story that has been done in the past. Intuition is the love child, I would say, between experience and imagination. So you have experience and you have imagination, and the two working together are what really fuses together and becomes your active intuition. As a writer, I lean into my intuition because I've done a lot of writing in my life, and I've done a lot of reading in my life, and I've studied a lot of movies in my life, and I've read a lot of craft books in my life. And from all of that experience, I have kind of an internal North Star that lets me know what I need to do with my characters or where I need to go with my story. And so I'm very heavily a discovery writer or a pantser, and my intuition is the reason I can be. So that's my little short wrap up of what intuition is. I would like to hear what you guys have to say about it.
Yeah, I love your connection of, how intuition is sort of this crossroads between experience and imagination. Because I've always felt like, if somebody says, what's your definition of intuition? To me, intuition is a profound knowing that goes beyond my mind. It doesn't come from my mind. And so thinking of it as coming from these spaces of experience combined with imagination makes total sense to me. And I think that, one of the reasons that this topic fascinates me so much is I have intellectually relied heavily on my mind for my writing until recently, and have struggled with creating outlines that I didn't follow, getting into a story, and then having my whole plan fall apart for that story. And rather than leaning into it, I tried to think my way out of it, and it would never end well. And I think that that's why I've struggled to finish a lot of things. Yeah. And so for me right now in my writing journey, I am heavily leaning into my intuition because I realize that I have fought against it, and that my past efforts at being a plotter, outliner, or whatever you want to call it, have not worked well for me.
Denying the intuition creates its own problems.
Sure does.
How about you, Melody? What's
What
your
do you
thoughts
think
on
intuition is?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like what you said, Gina, about it. It's goes beyond mind and thought, and that's certainly true for me. For me, it is also not just the knowing, but a visceral experience, which may be subtle, but felt in my body, that knowing, it's sort of like it clicks and it's right. And it's not, that knowing is not dependent on facts and however much, sometimes not even dependent on my own experience. And sometimes I need to release my experience and definitely my thoughts of how things should be, um, and allow that to come out naturally and organically. And I had this happen in the book I'm writing now, historical fiction, and my main character, I was going to have her be this strong, independent woman. Well, this is in the early 1900s, and she was going to make up her own mind, and she was going to do this and the truth of it is, in her situation, in that time and that era, there would have been some pretty serious consequences for her doing
Mm-hmm.
that.
Yeah.
And she has a mission. And so she is working within the restrictions, societal, marital, whatever, that she has in order to meet her goal. And it definitely surprised me how she reacted and responded
Mm.
with that in mind.
Interesting. Interesting.
And you're leaning into that, huh?
I am. And it's like, and then that's happening with several other characters in the book. And I go along thinking, well, this is how they're going to do it. And this is what's going to happen. And they're like, oh, no, sorry, sorry. Nice idea, but that's not where we're going. That's not who we are.
Mm.
So trusting that and listening that, because it's made them more interesting, in my opinion.
Yeah, you mentioned it being a visceral response, and that's something that this may sound contradictory, but when I know that I'm following my intuition, I feel it in my body, and there's no emotion around it.
Yeah, you're gonna have to
And that
explain that a
sounds like it's a
little. Yep. Yeah.
yeah, it sounds like that's a contradiction, but it's like I can feel that it is the way I'm supposed to go because there's no fear, there's no second guessing, there's no sometimes there's surprise, so it's not without emotion because sometimes it does surprise me, but it's almost like so a mutual friend of ours, Vicky Spray, talks about how intuition doesn't care whether you follow it or not. Like it's sort of like I'm here, take me or not. And so it's like when I know that that I'm following my intuition, I have this sort of lack of emotion around it. It's like I'm not worried about the outcome. I know that I can trust what's going to happen is the right thing when I follow my intuition. I don't know if I'm making any sense or not, but it's
Mhm.
almost like my body knows it, and so I'm calm and I'm settled and I don't have the fear or the
Mhm.
worry. And there's no fear, I guess, is really where I'm getting at. It's like when I follow
Mhm.
my intuition, it feels
There's no
right.
conflict. There's no yeah.
There's no
Mm.
attachment.
Yeah,
Mm. Mm.
yeah, that's a good way
Yeah.
of
Yeah,
putting it.
there's emotion, but there's no attachment to a specific outcome for me.
Hmm.
And sometimes fear can pop up again, but I find that's mostly to do when I get back in my head
Hmm.
and go, but what, questioning what I'm getting intuitively.
Oh, and that hits on the trust element, which is why I think I've
Yeah.
not followed mine in the past, is because I didn't feel like I could trust my intuition.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think part of that is just, I think, natural human inclination. And part of it is a lot of the training a lot of us have received. Even, none of us here have an MFA. Like, that's not the kind of training I'm talking about. But like all the books we read about writing and the writer interviews that we heard and seen and all this sort of has been like, well, you have to have this outline, you have to know the theme, and you have to know where it's going, and you have to know all this other stuff. You have to be on top of all these other elements. And literally taking the trust out of the equation because it can be so uncertain. I think that's one of the things I hear with a lot of writers who are interested in using discovery writing techniques is that they're scared of where it will take them. So and
Hmm.
that's, part of the whole trust issue that you're talking about there.
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think you can confirm this, Gina, and maybe you, Kimbu, too, is that when you start distrusting your intuition, um, that can stop the whole
Mm-hmm.
process.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's where a lot of
definitely.
writers just put the whole work down completely.
Yeah, I think that
I
goes
can't
back
say
to what I
that. I
was.
can't go that deep. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, that goes back to me saying I could, I've got myself into a place where I wasn't finishing things, and
Mm.
I think that you're exactly right. You're spot on with that, Melody.
We can't trust the process one way or another when we get down that deep. Like the logic brain has gotten us into the problem, and we don't trust the intuition to get us out of the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that
Another thing
feeling.
I've noticed
Mm.
about intuition, and maybe this is related to why I've been reluctant to trust it, is that sometimes the intuitive hit comes out of left field.
yeah,
I'll have a recognition that I'm supposed to do something in a certain way, and I'll like be surprised by it because it seems like it is so maybe unrelated to what I'm doing or thinking at the moment, or so different than the way I had planned things that I'm just totally surprised by it. But that's something that I've noticed when I have had an intuitive hit, looking back on the ones that have been the right ones for me to follow, when I've leaned into them, they've come out of left field.
exactly.
And I
And especially if these intuitive hits seem unconventional or don't go by the normal writing rules or structure or whatever. And that's where doubt creeps in a lot of times. Are you sure? Are you sure you should be doing that? That doesn't seem right. Everybody else wouldn't say that would be right, you know?
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, but we're given these hits for a
Mm-hmm.
reason.
And I think one of the interesting things too is that when intuition hits the first time, we don't call it intuition, we call it inspiration. Like I know, Gina, the inspiration
Ooh.
for Dancing at the Orange Peel, that wasn't logically thought out. Melody, I know that your inspiration for your historical fiction came from, bits and pieces and ideas and dreams that you had. I know that mine for Transmigrated Terry came just, kind of fully formed out of some other ideas that I was doing. I didn't logically fight my way to it. But when it's at that point in this process, we call it inspiration. That's my thought.
Mm. Yeah, I would agree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Definitely agree with that.
Yeah, and so I'm listening to you guys talk about these situations, and everybody's been hearing me rambling about Transmigrated Terry for a while now, because I really hit a stone wall with the character development of Terry herself, who's the main character, and about like how would she approach this issue and how would she be acting about it, what would she think about it, and I was really trying to logic my way through this problem of this character development, this important piece of her character. And so, yeah, I solved it by just sitting down and writing a whole scene. And by the time I was telling my friend Lydia, who's another writer, yesterday, when I started writing this scene, it was still that kind of stilted. I wasn't really sure how she would react thing. And then I just let go. And I was just like, okay, let's just do it the way I tell people to do it. Let's follow my own medicine and sit down and just write this scene and don't try to stage it. Don't try to figure out where it's going. By the time I got to the end of the scene, it was just Terry's voice was so strong in my head. Like I just had this entire understanding of who this character was and where she was coming from and how she would react in that situation. And for me, it's resonating with what you said earlier, Gina. There was this sense of peace in the sense of I've got this I'm following this intuition. I don't have any fear anymore. So that was a weight off my shoulders, but also there was joy when I follow my intuition, when I get into these stories and I'm
Mhm.
just riding along with the characters. I have so much fun and so much joy in it. Intuition
Mhm.
for me, when I let it in, which is the big problem, yeah, it just brings that sense of almost childish childish wonder in my stories. And so, yeah, when I hit that point, I was kind of like dancing around the room. It's like, it was great.
Awesome.
That's
I'm
that's great, and that's perfect. I just want to just pop this in here for a minute because in my book, when we talk about the core emotion of fear, that childlike wonder and awe is a balanced expression of
Oh,
fear,
okay.
wonder and excitement.
Interesting.
So cool.
that's beautiful.
Yeah.
When it comes to actually like leaning into my intuition, that's what I've been focusing on doing for the last 2 years. And,
Mm-hmm.
like that being so foreign to me, I really had to try a couple of different things to see how that would work for me. And I am a very vivid dreamer. And one
Mm.
of the things that my creativity coach, Dr. Eric Mazel, has always suggested when you're working on a story is that if you get stuck somewhere or you're having an issue with knowing what your characters are going to do next, before you go to bed, make sure that that's the last thing that you ponder on. Just put it in your mind and let it basically sit there overnight. And I know that Rhett Devane, my friend that I interviewed a couple of episodes back, she uses this practice too of like she wakes up in the morning and whatever she was pondering about sometimes is solved. And so I've
Mhm.
tried to do that and also just releasing any of my tendencies to overthink and to force thought or trying to figure out
Mm.
a plot point and or an approach. And specific incident recently, you guys have heard me talk about going to the Appalachian Writers Workshop, and I've struggled with in my novel of what point of view I'm going to use. Am I going to do it strictly in Libby's, the young girls, or am I going to alternate between her and her mother? And so one of the ideas that came up, because this is historical fiction, and there is the tendency in historical fiction, or the the opportunity to unintentionally overlay our current thinking about a situation or a belief into that historical context.
Mm-hmm.
And you really can't do that. And so one of the ideas, one of the options that is available to me is having Libby be an adult looking back on her childhood. And that would solve several problems and bring up several other problems. And so in the past, my tendency would be to come back from a workshop like that and like just pound my brain about how I could make that happen or whether I needed to make that happen. And I have given myself the grace after coming off of that workshop of letting my intuition solve that problem.
Mm.
And so every day I am introducing the idea into my brain so that it can sit in my subconscious. And at some point, I know, and I have to be patient, but at some point, I know that my intuition is going to solve that problem for me.
It's that trust issue again.
It is.
I,
Oh, man. It's like,
I
hurry up,
like
hurry up,
that.
hurry up.
I just want to
But no,
I
know.
you can't
know.
hurry
Yeah,
it.
no, you can't.
Well, you bring up Gina, and one of the ways that I need to remind myself to allow my intuition to come in is to hold my idea, my thought, my storyline
Mm-hmm.
loosely
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
and lightly, and to give it space to go where it needs to go instead of me getting in there with the pliers and the wrench and trying to
Yeah.
manhandle that thing
Yeah.
into place.
You used a really important word, Melody, holding.
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah.
think where a lot of writers, when they're faced with a dead end or they don't know what they're going to do next, what happens is they don't hold on to the story. They step away from it. And they step so far away
Oh,
from it that
damn.
it's
Yeah.
hard for them to see the landscape and it's hard for them to re enter that world. And so, even if you're not actively writing, at least holding it there in a gentle way and keeping it in your
Hmm.
subconscious thought is I think is a good way to lean into the intuition and to not get so far from it that you then do create this span of time when you are not putting words on the page that we call writer's block.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I
I like
love
that.
that. The idea of holding and the idea of stepping, um, of holding as opposed to stepping away, because there are times we need to step away. There's times when you need objective distance and you're like, is this working? And, the logic holding and all that sort of stuff. But when you're in that point of, I think I'm going to kind of circle back around to the emotional, the body. If you're at that point where you're feeling congested, where you're feeling like something's not working and you're trying to, like you said, Melanie, you're trying to get the wrench and the hammer and trying to break it apart to make it work. Maybe that's the time when you need to, instead of stepping back, just hold that space and let the intuition kind of filter in and help direct you on the solution, because that really resonates with me so much in the experiences I've had with it, where your idea of thinking about the characters right before you go to bed, to dream about them. I do a lot of thinking and role playing on and mentally on my walks with my dog. It's just holding that space, but and again, back to what Melody said too, is like letting go of the expectations. That is
Hmm.
super hard. Even I have problems with that, and I think that's one of the stumbling blocks I've had in general with my career, and I've talked about it on this podcast before, where the expectation of right to market in genre fiction is very strong and very smart. Like, if you want to make a lot of money really fast in genre fiction, such as romance or science fiction or military science fiction, then writing to market is absolutely the way to do it. Wasn't the answer for me, but that message of, well, you're not doing it the way other people think you should do it, it's a hard one to get past. So holding that space for the story is super important.
And another thing that came to mind as we were talking about this, I watched I think it was a Netflix movie called Papa Hemingway. It was a little about one interaction this person had with, I don't know if it's entirely fictional. Anyway, it talked about Hemingway's life in his later years, and he suffered terribly from writer's block. And one of the things the character said in there as the reason he suffered from the writer's block was because he wanted to write. I can't even begin because I can't write the first perfect
Ooh,
sentence.
yeah, that's a great way not to get anywhere.
Yeah, he was so bound up in, and he had received, this is already after he had received all these accolades and, you know, rewards from his previous works. And his perfectionist tendencies blocked him from writing, I think, anything in the last years of his life, and he suffered personally and terribly from it. He wouldn't write anything unless he deemed it a perfect sentence.
That feeling like you have to live up to I'm sure in his case, live up to the myth, because he was already such a mythologized writer by
Yeah,
that point.
or his own inner harsh critique.
Yeah.
Perfectionism. I think we talked about that in an episode.
Yeah,
didn't
once
we?
or twice.
Yes, we kind of did.
Yes,
It
yes.
does tend to come up, doesn't it? Oh, man.
does.
It does. It does. It does. And intuition is a good way to fight that, I think, because of the trust element, because of our love of the story. Like, if we can remember that we love the story, that we want to tell this story and hold space for that story, I think it would be easier to lean into intuition and trust in our instincts and our intuition than it is to try to meet that perfectionist goal, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yes.
It's easier, but the mind never believes that to be true.
It sucks. I'm telling you, man. I hate it.
Yeah. There's a gentleness to following intuition, I think.
Oh, absolutely. You cannot force or manhandle intuition. It's like a candle flame, and as soon as you try to hold it too tightly, it's out. You can't hold it in your grasp. It's like water in a
Mm-hmm.
way,
Mm-hmm.
as a form and a shape, but as soon as you try to grasp it, it's gone.
And yet, I mean, in
It,
in the studies I've done of Buddhism and the Tao, it's so powerful. Water is one of the most
mm,
powerful energies on this
oh,
planet,
absolutely.
but you can't you can hold it maybe in a bottle, like, hey, I've got my water jug, but
Right.
as a element, it's not easy to capture. You build the dam, but
Hmm.
it'll eventually break it down.
So we're coming to the end of our time, ladies. I wonder if you would be willing to um, have any tips about intuition to offer the listeners, or like how you practice it, or anything that you can share with the listeners that would help them sort of lean into their own intuition or be more open to the idea of doing that.
Well, one of the things I talk about in my book is that it's important to keep honing your intuition by studying the craft, by reading other writers, by watching movies, like listening to music. It's all about keeping that connection open and learning from it. But that's a very general answer. I think a more specific sense, uh, I actually recently just posted about this exercise, whereas I called What's the Worst That Could Happen? Where if you are in a specific stumbling block, if you've written yourself into a corner and you think, oh my gosh, I've got to go back to the beginning and do it all over again, just write the next scene or write a scene or write a moment that's the worst thing that could happen in that scenario. I mean, it could be outlandish, it could be wild and crazy. Aliens invade in the middle of your Jane Austen romance. Like, it just doesn't, like, the point is to circumvent the logic, circumvent that hammer and wrench analogy that Melody was talking about. Instead of doing that, just going completely around it and like throwing a big bucket of sand over everything and just like, well, now what are you going to do? Don't be afraid of the mess, because that's going to make it messy. And you may not end up using that scene, but if you lean into that and kind of just say, okay, I'm opening the doors, whatever happens, happens. Let me see where intuition will take me. Like for me with writing Terry, it might get you to the solution that you need, even if you don't actually use those particular set of words. So that's some advice that I have of late that I've been giving a lot of people because I've seen it's pretty effective.
Nice. For me, I need quiet and space to hear my intuition. As we talk, I would invite our listeners to check out my chapter on winter, because it is about quiet, the still small voice. It won't hear it over all the other shouting going on in your brain, by your little fear gremlins. So I personally need quiet downtime and the space to allow it to come in to my consciousness awareness.
Yes.
That's one thing essential for me.
How about you, Gina?
Well, I would definitely agree with needing the quiet, because I think we're bombarded by so many external things on a daily basis, just constant input from social media and all the other medias and other individuals, that hearing ourselves think sometimes, or hearing ourselves just not think and just be, is important into recognizing that your intuition is tapping at you. I also want to acknowledge what you said, Kimbu, about, studying the craft and how that can help you follow your intuition. And it made me realize, there's over and over again, I've heard writers who've gotten a lot of words on the page say that they've like randomly pulled out something that they wrote and reread it and gone, oh man, I wrote that? Dang, that's good.
Right?
And
Yeah,
I
same,
think what's
same.
I can
happening,
attest.
yeah, I think so
I can
many of us have
attest to
done
that. Yeah.
that. And I think what's happening there is that when we've studied the craft and we've like created those neural pathways and brought that knowledge in, and then we've combined that experience with our imagination, which brings us back to what you were talking about earlier, Kimbu, that's
Mm.
that intersection that happens, and it happens so subtly and maybe so distant from the experience of learning that you didn't consciously recognize what you were doing in that moment, but you
Mm-hmm.
were following your intuition when you wrote that. And then when you've come back to it later, you've gone, oh man, I did that. I wrote that. And it was that combination of the experience and the imagination meeting each other.
That's a beautiful
I
moment.
do that about half of my book. It's Soul of the Seasons. That way, I decided recently to reread it in full, which I hadn't done since I went into print. I'm like, I wrote that? That is, where did that come from? That was pretty
Gosh, I'm
cool.
brilliant. How did
Yeah.
that happen?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Whoa.
And the last thing I would add to is just what we've already really talked about is just holding a thing very loosely in your subconscious if you're having an issue with your writing. Just, staying connected to that character or maybe to that scene that you're having trouble writing or that approach to your writing that is
Mm-hmm.
giving you trouble, and just holding that loosely for a while and seeing where that leads you without trying to overthink it or force it. And I think that that's a good way of solving problems, and it's also a good way of just practicing leaning into your intuition.
Highly
Yeah.
recommended.
All right. And like a playful game of what
Hey,
if,
yeah.
Yeah.
Just like,
where you
ah.
weren't too attached, like, well, what if this
Mm-hmm.
happened? And what if
Mm-hmm.
that happened? And see what pops up.
That's a
Mm-hmm.
great
Yes,
suggestion.
definitely. It's a wonderful
I
conversation, women. I
know.
love
This has
this.
been
I
great.
love this. I
As
hope
always.
the listeners have taken as much away from it as I have.
Mm.
And so this wraps up another episode of Around the Writer's Table. And I hope that we'll see you again on another future episode. We've got lots of interviews lined up. We're alternating interviews with discussions like this with the three of us together, sometimes the two of us when one of us has internet issues or travel or whatever. But
Yeah,
that's why there's three
Hurricane
of us here
Debbie.
with you. So, yes, look at that. She did happen. So thank you, listeners, for being here with us. We always love our time with you, and thank you for making time in your day to be with us.
Thank you so much, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us around the writer's table. Please feel free to suggest a topic or a guest by emailing info@aroundthewriterstable.com. Music provided with gracious permission by Langtree. A link to their music is on our homepage at aroundthewriterstable.com. Everyone here around the writer's table wishes you joy in your writing and everyday grace in your living. Take care until next time.